It must have been about 9 p.m. when I arrived at the 9:30 Club in Washington, D.C. The date was September 28, 2001. Yes, just a little over 2 weeks after the day that will live on in infamy. And there I was, only a short distance in space and time away from the explosion that rocked the Pentagon. I hadn't been looking forward to this trip. Rat Dog was playing the 9:30 Club, but I didn't come with money for a ticket. I hoped that maybe I could make a little money selling my kids' moms, I'll just refer to her as X in this essay, X's homemade clothes, and also hopefully I would be able to cook some quesadillas and grilled cheese and maybe, just maybe, make a trade of a bootleg Grateful Dead videotape or two for a ticket. This was going to be a one night out, back by dawn vending venture. There didn't seem to be much reason to have the toddler riding 3 hours just to hang out in a city parking lot for a couple hours, then turn around and ride back home 3 hours. So I had made the trip solo. Although it seemed like good logic, there were more and more of these solo trips these days. In fact, I had just made a trip the previous night, which was why I had arrived late at this one. I was surprised to see that there were still a lot of people just now headed towards the show. I hadn't bothered to check to see when the show started before I left, but I figured it would be over sometime after 11 p.m. As I saw a large number of people just now beginning to line up the doors, I figured that the show was scheduled late in order to keep a crowd till 2 a.m. to boost alcohol sales. The 9:30 Club is in a seedy neighborhood, and there were street hustlers wearing yellow vests, which were just disguises, so that they would look like they were official parking lot attendants. They were charging $10 for parking spaces on the street, which were actually supposed to be free. This wasn't my first trip to this venue, so I didn't fall for that trick. I found a decent parking space not too far from the venue, and I figured I would walk around with some of X's patchworks in front of the inflow of people and try and make some pre-show sales. But the crowd seemed uninterested at best, seemingly annoyed and rude at worst. This was a weird crowd on this night. But it would only take one sale to cover the cost of the trip. Then, all of a sudden, I began to see familiar faces headed the opposite direction. As I recognized someone I knew, I asked, "What's going on? Is it set break?" "No, man, Rat Dog's over." "There are 2 shows tonight," he answered. "Oh, really? Who's the second show?" I asked. "Some group called the Afghan Whigs," he replied. "I've never heard of them." So it turned out these guys were the closers, and Rat Dog had already ended. There were staff from the 9:30 Club walking the sidewalks demanding that no vending take place. The 10-minute rush made its way past me without me making any sales. This was one of the few times that ever happened. I hadn't been ready. If I had known that the show was about to let out, I would have been set up with my grill to make some food sales. It would have had to have been a quick setup, fast breakdown, done right at blowout, but it definitely could have happened. Usually I would make between $50 to $300 gross sales at these little club shows. During the brief, chaotic, interdirectional flow of people, I met up with a few friends. Unk from Syracuse and Cherokee from Canandaigua, and Russo from New York City. We all shared the same home away from home, lot. Lot, short for parking lots, which meant whatever parking lot we could use to vend near the concert. Russo is a 5'4", dark-skinned immigrant. He was too wild, unpredictable, and controversial to vend festivals legitimately. But in the campgrounds and on the parking lots, he was one of the great masters. He knew how to make good money food vending, thousands of dollars a night at big shows, but not at these little club shows. He informed me that he wasn't planning on setting up. Russo always had workers with him. This time it was Unk and Cherokee. Cherokee and Unk are not new to Lot, and they know how to survive on their own. For this reason, they are not ideal workers for Russo, because they would only be willing to take so much shit before they would just walk off. The previous night, September 27th, Russo had someone else running his kitchen. At a show in Norfolk, at a club called the Norva. I arrived there in the middle of the show and set up my stand in the park across from the venue. Russo's worker was there hanging out with several other people. As I was beginning to set up, The guy working Russo's kitchen yelled over and told me, "Don't bother." The police came around and told us no vending in the park, he said. I replied that I was going to have to give it a shot all the same. I figure I'll get a warning the first time that they talk to me, I explained. When Russo came out of the show and saw that I was all set up and doing business, and his stand was half packed down, and his worker was just hanging out, he became furious. He picked up a dish towel and began whacking and cussing the guy. He continued this until he had driven the guy clear out of the park and across the street, where he stood on the sidewalk crying and begging for rides to the next show. I left the Norva Theater with all that drama fresh in my mind and drove 5 hours home to West Virginia, where I got a few hours ease. So it was a whole new day and a whole new Russo with a whole new crew when I saw him on September 28th, 2001. Now, where do I begin to tell you about Russo? Well, I'll start at the beginning of how I came to learn of him. I heard stories about him a year before I actually met him. The year was 1997, and I was 24 years old. I met a food vendor named Paul who was in his mid-50s, and he mentioned Russo. He asked if I knew him, and I told him I didn't. Everyone knows Russo, he declared. He told a story about getting thrown out of a hotel because the owner found out that Russo was scrubbing down all of his vending equipment in the shower. Paul didn't seem like someone to just name drop. And I don't think he said everyone knows Russo to make me feel like a newbie. I genuinely think he expected me to be familiar with Russo, so I kept this name in the back of my mind. Now skip forward to the next summer, 1998, further tour. I was in a totally different life situation that year. I had a girlfriend, the aforementioned ex, and she had part ownership of a van. It all began well enough when I started off tour with her and 4 other friends in one full-sized van that summer with a stack of Grateful Dead videotapes. I was going to sell one video at each show to cover my share of gas expenses and get a miracle ticket in every night. That's the way it went at first. I'd get my miracle ticket and say, "Okay, babe, see you after the show." But when my stock of Grateful Dead videotapes ran out and my girlfriend had a falling out with the other co-owners of the van, I found myself reeled into selling grilled cheese sandwiches with my girlfriend to cover our travel expenses. The other 2 co-van owners were sisters, and therefore they were the controlling majority of the van, and they returned to Cleveland. X and I caught a ride to Cleveland in a different van, where we got X's Volkswagen Jetta out of storage and headed out on tour in it. It got much better gas mileage, and gas was only a little over $1 a gallon, so it was doable. We just had a little one burner that screwed right on top of a small propane canister to cook on. We didn't have a table, so we cooked right off the ground. People didn't mind that I was barefoot and cooking off the ground. $1 grilled cheese was a sure seller. But it demanded time and effort, and slowly but surely, we began adding to our setup. It was during this time that I first got acquainted with who Russo was. We were at a show in Las Vegas, and naturally, it was very hot that summer day. We had come prepared with a car full of cold drinks, and we sold every one of them before the show even started. So we were actually able to afford to eat something other than grilled cheese that night. X walked up Shakedown and came back with a French bread pizza. "That looks good. Who's making those?" I asked with intentions of getting one myself. She told me that he was a guy with a foreign accent. I went and I looked for a while, but it was hard trying to listen for a foreign accent with so many people all around. So I came back empty-handed. She said, "Okay, I'll walk part way up with you and I'll show you." We couldn't both walk off from our stand for very long. We walked until Russo's stand was visible, and she pointed and said, "That one." "Oh, you mean the one with the black guy?" I said. "Yes," she confirmed. "Well, why didn't you just say that?" I said, laughing. "You had me walking around listening for foreign accents." Russo wasn't the only black guy around, but since black people were less than 10% of the crowd, it would certainly have been a key distinction worth mentioning. By the time fall of 1998 rolled around, X and Russo were acquainted. He would give her free French bread pizza, and he would put on her homemade string-tied girl halter tops and stand in the middle of Shakedown shouting for people to buy them. I'm not sure he ever actually helped X make any sales, but she appreciated the gesture. He did this for other girls who made clothes to sell also. I heard a story about someone insulting Russo while he was wearing a dress, and Russo grabbed his butcher knife and chased the guy down shakedown with his dress blowing in the breeze. We were at a show in Worcester, Massachusetts the first time I saw Russo act violently with my own eyes. I could see his stand from where I was set up. He was the only one at his stand when he got in an argument with the sole customer in front of him. He pulled his butcher knife up into stabbing position like the shower scene in Psycho. A guy named Rob, who I was talking to, went rushing to attack the guy Russo was arguing with. The guy was quickly chased away. When Rob returned, he said that he always had Russo's back. I didn't know Russo well enough to feel the same way. From what I gathered, he liked to get drunk and crazy, and I wasn't going to presume that he was right in all conflicts that may arise. A couple days later, the last show of Fall Fish Tour 1998, still in Worcester, Massachusetts, X and I ended up right beside of Russo. Me and X were always normally out on the outer fringes of lot. The big-time lot vendors like Russo always got the good spots. But we did have a table by this point, and we ended up getting the spot smack dab in the center of Shakedown. Russo was to my left, and Kathy, the Christian bus lady, was to my right. Kathy was well known on tour at this time also. She had long blondish white dreads, and she handed out free food and cartoon books encouraging people to get off tour and go to church. I didn't agree with her mission. I thought it would be better if she were to be the church for the tour community, rather than condemn the community in the name of the church. Nonetheless, I respected the fact that she fed people. I had eaten her free food myself before. After the show started and Lot began to thin out a bit, X went off for a while to visit friends. Rob came by and gave me some Indian medicine to put me into a heightened state of awareness, and it sure did, very much so. When it kicked in, it seemed like we were now really in the center of something. But being so in tune with all the many things going on around made it hard for me to focus on the very necessary work at hand. This was the last show for a while, and we needed to make some money. X was already a few months pregnant with our first child. So I was keeping my mind on work the best I could, but it was hard not to notice that Fast Eddie was beside me with one of his sons. I'd seen Fast Eddie in the movie Tie-Dyed before I'd seen him on lot. Here he was beside me, black leather jacket over a tie-dyed jumpsuit, long black and gray hair held out of his face by a tie-dyed bandana. He was hitting on a girl who was about 19 years old who was riding on the Christian bus. He said, "What do you think, son? You think she'd make a good stepmom?" To his son, who was about the girl's age. Kathy was standing there cross-armed but smiling, and you could tell that she thought that he was actually a little bit charming. She said, "Oh, get out of here, Eddie." The girl was shy and gigglish towards Eddie. It brought to mind the mental image of the big bad wolf shaking a fruit tree, testing to see which apples were ripe. This one was not, but a little shake of the tree never harmed anyone. And yes, I know that wolves don't eat apples, but you get the analogy. The whole scene seemed very harmless. Nothing was going to come of this except maybe he was going to teach his son how to flirt. At Russo's stand on my left, his girl worker was rocking out to a Sublime CD. She was short and kind of nerdy, but thrilled to be working for Russo. She sang along and danced while she cooked. I was never big on Sublime. I thought they had a good sound, but their lyrics were a bit twisted. But seeing how much she was enjoying this album made it an amusing, happy thing. In this chaos, we were making money. Then all of a sudden, I heard Russo yell, "Look!" I turned towards him and was shocked to realize he was yelling at me. He was holding the handle of a skillet, and the skillet was attached to a cooler lid. It dawned on me what I had done. I had laid down a hot skillet on a cooler. I had thought that the cooler was ours, but it was Russo's. The skillet had melted to the cooler lid, and that is what Russo was showing me. "Look what you did," he said. I wondered if this was going to be one of those incidents when Russo goes off. "Oh man, I'm sorry," I apologized. Russo laughed and said, "It's okay, be more careful." And that was it, and he went back to his business. So this was my first real interaction with Russo. After the show, we got hit by a major blowout. X was taking note of how much money Russo was taking in. Rob was telling me how I was going to need to get an RV like Russo had at the time, if I expected to be able to survive with a kid on tour. But we were not doing too bad ourselves. In the midst of the blowout, a big group carrying a keg, and we're getting a little bit ghetto, sat it down just a few feet behind X and me. As the crowd around the keg began to instantly grow, we found ourselves pressed towards our table. I knew I could not stand for this, especially with X being pregnant. She was looking to me to do something also, but I knew these guys were not going to listen to me. They already knew that they were being rude, and they were looking for conflict. All of a sudden, Fast Eddie walked up and picked up the keg and said, "This is the wrong place for this," and carried it a safe distance away before setting it down. I would not have been able to pull that off. In the end, we made more money than we'd ever made that night. The people who had some pull on Shakedown had quite literally made room for us. And so, as time passed, Russo became a familiar acquaintance. Just when X and me had risen to a level where we could make enough money for the two of us to get by on, we faced the next challenge of making enough for 2 plus a baby. So we got more serious about vending. As we did, I could understand guys like Paul and Russo much better. They also had families they were providing for. Paul's approach to his work was like the exact opposite of Russo. With Paul, everything is neat and clean and orderly at all times. He usually does everything himself, and he is always sane and sober. Russo, on the other hand, is usually partying on lot and has lots of people around. Paul steers clear of drama. Russo plunges right into it. The antics and the craziness are part of the attraction to a stand. But Russo does lay down the law on how things will be done. Both Paul and Russo are effective in their own way. I saw Russo yelling and fighting with workers and custies quite a bit, but he'd always been friendly with me. He would yell over from a stand, "Hey, it's Bobby and his little son Bobby," even if he was drunk, and in the middle of an argument he'd stop and smile and say hi. But I had never hung out with him one-on-one until Halloween 1999. Widespread Panic was playing a 3-day show with on-site vending in New Orleans. On the third day, Russo was drunk, but needed to make a store run to restock on supplies. His setup had his van blocked in, and he didn't want to take down his stand to make the store run. He offered me $100 to take him to Sam's Club. That was going to work out great for me too, because I needed to restock myself. Sam's Club was only a few miles away. I didn't have a membership, but Russo was going to let me shop on his. So we sat out from lot and arrived at Sam's Club no trouble. Russo had fallen asleep during the short drive. I woke him up and said, "Okay, here we are." He opened his eyes and took a look around and said, "No, Bobby, this is the wrong Sam's Club. We need to go to Slidell." "No, bullshit too, Russo. You said Sam's Club and this is Sam's Club," I argued. We argued back and forth until Russo reluctantly agreed to go into this Sam's Club. We separated after entering the store to do our shopping. I got what I needed and I had the cart full. I went towards the front of the store where the registers were to wait for Russo. All of a sudden, I heard a big commotion behind me. I turned around to see Russo coming through the store angrily while 2 Sam's Club employees followed behind him. "But sir, wait!" One of the employees called out to him. "No!" he shouted without turning back. "What's going on, Russo?" I asked as he approached. "Come on, Bobby. They have mold on their bread. We buy nothing," Russo shouted. And then he turned over his shoulder and shouted back to the employees following him, "I buy nothing from this place." I had no choice but to abandon my cart and follow Russo out of the store. I caught up with him in the parking lot. "We must go to Slidell, Bobby," he demanded. "Well, that sucks, Russo, because I already have my shopping done," I said. "Bobby, I tell you not to come to this Sam's Club. It's ran by stupid black people. We go to the white Sam's Club in Slidell." As we got back in the van and started moving, I said, "You're black, Russo, and you're not stupid. Do not compare me to those dirty, lazy," and then he said the N-word. As we drove away from New Orleans to Slidell and back, I got the chance to ask Russo a couple of questions I was curious about. I asked him if his name Russo was short for something. He said, "It's short for La Russo, but that's not my real name either." Russo was still really drunk, and it's hard to understand him when he talked. I sometimes had a hard time understanding him even when he was sober. He rolls his R's and rolls his eyes, and he chuckles, and he makes funny faces when he talks. So sometimes it's not so important what he is talking about. He is entertaining just by the way he says it. I asked Russo what country he was from. He gave me a very long answer to that question that I tried to decipher. What I thought he had said was that he was from an Egyptian community in Italy, but it turned out that he had said he was from an Italian community in Eritrea, which that didn't tell me much anyway because I had no idea where Eritrea was. Now, flashback forward to here, the 930 Club, Washington, D.C., on September 28, 2001. There was still a sense of electricity in the air because of the shock of 9/11. On the way to the club, I had passed by the Veterans Hospital. Its gates were being guarded by uniformed soldiers with battle helmets and guns. No one knew who or what might be attacked next. This was part of the reason that I wasn't looking forward to this trip to D.C., but the main reason I didn't really want to come to this show was because I knew that this venue was tough to work. Now here I was, having made no money. "Come, Bobby, come to dinner with us," Russo insisted. "There's no way I can do that," I replied. "I have to stay here and work the out." "What out? This was the out," Russo argued. "The out for the second show," I said. "You waste your time, Bobby. There won't be nothing. They are not deadhead crowd," Russo stated. "Everyone has to eat, and I'm going to set up my grill." "They will not let you do that." "I'm going to set it up fast at just the right minute." "Listen to me, Bobby. Be a big waste of time." "I can't afford not to go out to eat, Russo." "It'll be my treat. We are going to my family's restaurant. You spend absolutely nothing," Russo offered. "Russo, if I don't at least try to make some money, X is going to be pissed." "Oh, I know, Bobby. X is very good girl, but she will be pissed, yes. But she will be even more pissed if you get a ticket from the police while you waste your time. Now come, you will be my guest," Russo encouraged. "Okay, what the heck," I reluctantly agreed. "Also, you will be my driver." "I will leave my van here," Russo added. "I can't, Russo. My car is packed full of stuff. It'll be okay, Bobby. You pull your car up to my van, we load your stuff into my van. We go out to eat, then we come back. Please, Bobby, you must. I'm too drunk to drive," Russo insisted. "Can't Unc or Cherokee drive?" I asked. "No, they will not listen to me, and they will get us lost," he predicted. Cherokee and Unc laughed. So I said I'd do it. Then he handed me a bank bag containing his wallet, which was so full that it couldn't be folded. "Also, I need you to hold on to this for me, please." I tried to refuse, but he insisted, so I put it into my car. I went and got my car and pulled up to Russo's van. After we loaded my vending supplies into his van, the four of us headed off for dinner. "So your family owns an Italian restaurant?" I asked. "No, not Italian, Ethiopian," Russo replied. "I thought you said your family was Egyptian Italians," I stated. "Not Italian Egyptian, Italian Eritrean," Russo said. "Eritrea used to be part of Ethiopia." Russo directed us to a restaurant that had a neon sign indicating that it was Ethiopian food. There were paid parking lots nearby. I asked Russo if I needed to go to one of these lots. "You'll have to cover parking too," I stated. Russo laughed and said, "No, we need not pay." He insisted that I pull right up in front of the place instead. He said, "Wait here," and he got out of the car. Russo went into the restaurant while I waited in the street. I had to wave a couple of cars to go around me, and I was beginning to get impatient. I saw Russo coming out of the restaurant. Then I saw two large wooden fence doors open beside the restaurant. Each door was being pulled open by a black man in a suit. Russo motioned for me to drive through the open fence doors. I pulled the car into a little private parking lot behind the place. Russo talked cheerfully to the two guys in suits as we followed them into the restaurant. When we got inside, Russo walked up to a man in a suit who was older than the other two. The man was smiling with Russo, and Russo motioned with me with his hand, saying, "Come, come." Russo introduced me to the guy and explained to me that it was his cousin, who he had come from Ethiopia with at the same time when they were both 9. Russo told his cousin, "This is my friend Bobby. He is a very good man, not like these other two." He motioned with his hand toward Cherokee and Unc. "They are my white trash workers." Cherokee and Unc both laughed at this. As we chatted with Russo's cousin for a minute, I noticed right off that Russo's cousin spoke English very clearly. You would never have guessed that they'd come to America at the same time. The men in suits seated us at a very large table. "There are only 4 of us. Do we really need a table this big?" Unc asked Russo. Russo laughed and said that we will need a lot of room for the food. All of the other people were black businessmen in suits. They looked at us, but I noticed that their eyes were following Russo and scrutinizing them. Russo went between talking with us at the table and talking to his cousin and another man while we waited for the food. Then men began to walk from the kitchen carrying big silver trays with silver lids and set them down on the table in front of us until the entire table was filled with a feast. As the men lifted the lids, fragrant steam wafted above the table. "Oh my God, I have no idea what this is, but it looks good," Cherokee remarked. Me and Unc nodded in agreement. Then Russo began explaining to us how to eat the food. There were no silverware involved. Instead, there were little pieces of flatbread that were used to pinch each bite from the various bowls and platters. All of the Ethiopians watched us as we enjoyed the delicious feast. Seeing how different Russo was from his cousin and the rest of the men made me recognize the similarity between him and I. He was an outsider even among his own people. Russo was blazing his own trail through life, and that had made him a spectacle. One might see Russo in his crazy operation and never guess he'd just put his son through Howard University. He had brought us to this restaurant because he wanted to show us off to his cousin. He wanted to show his cousin and lifelong friend a little bit of the strange adventure life he had made for himself. Also, he'd brought us there to show us where he was coming from. Gradually, the scrutinizing eyes watching Russo softened, and the men in suits slowly began to smile as Russo won their approval and impressed them. They liked watching Russo and his strange friends enjoying this restaurant. Cherokee suggested that we not ask what the food actually was in case it was something disgusting like zebra balls or camel tongue. As we began to get full, I said to Russo, "I need to get going, Russo." No, not yet," he insisted. "Come, have a beer and meet my cousin," he insisted. "I can't, Russo. It'll make me sleepy on the ride back," I said. "No, not if you just have 2 beers. Now come." So I left the big table and sat down at a table with him, his cousin, and another guy, and we all had a beer. Russo began telling his cousin that I lived on a farm in the beautiful mountains. His cousin and the other guys both smiled and seemed really interested in hearing about it. I said, "I'm not a farmer. I just have a garden. I just rent a farmhouse that sits out in the country." Russo started laughing and said, "Tell them this story about how you drove an hour and a half to Walmart and then forgot your cart full of supplies. Tom, he tell me that story and I love it." Russo smiled, and the other 2 guys were smiling too, waiting for me to tell a funny story. But the fact was there was no funny story, at least not in my mind. This guy Tom and his girlfriend Allison were staying with me and X for a while, and from our house, the closest Walmart was an hour and a half away. Tom and I had made the trip down a mountain and back, and then I realized I'd forgotten everything. I called the place, and they kept all the stuff for me in the cart, but it pissed me off I had to do another 3 hours of driving in the middle of the night. Never would I have expected that a year later I'd be sitting in an Ethiopian restaurant with 3 smiling Africans waiting for me to retell that story. Nonetheless, I told them, and they laughed as if it was an unheard of event. Then I began to ask them questions about where they'd come from. Russo's cousin explained to me that it was the land of Ethiopia and the nation of Eritrea. Finally, I was hearing these words spoken in clear English. I told them that as a child, I'd always thought of Ethiopia as a place where everyone was poor and starving, till I'd met a rich Ethiopian in college. "Ethiopia is the last of the ancient kingdoms on earth," Russo's cousin explained. "Egypt, Jerusalem, Babylon, and Rome all were conquered, but the kingdom of Ethiopia still stands." "I thought that the Russians conquered Ethiopia," I said innocently. I was recalling news I'd seen on TV in the 80s with Russian tanks rolling through Ethiopia. I saw the smiles leave the faces of Russo's cousin and friends instantly, but Russo smiled on the side of his mouth and said, "Ho, ho, ho," and he slapped me on the back as he laughed, and he left the table and went back over to the table with Cherokee and Unc. "That was not a conquest, that was an occupation," Russo's cousin argued. Then him and his friend began trying to explain to me the difference between a conquest and an occupation. It was clear that I had touched on a very touchy subject, but we talked it out smoothly enough. Then they told me about the Eritrean War. "When did this war take place?" I asked. "It just ended a year ago," I was told. They were surprised I didn't know about it. 60,000 Ethiopians were killed in that war. Russo returned to the table. I asked the guy, who was not Russo's cousin, what kind of business he was in, and he said that he owned parking lots. Russo's cousin then stated that he also owned parking lots. We were joined by another guy, and it turned out that he was also a parking lot owner. I asked if the parking lot business was a common business for Ethiopians to go into. They confirmed to me that it was. Mentally, I likened it to how people from India tend to own a lot of motels. After a second beer and a good long friendly talk with Russo, his cousin, and their friends, I told Russo I really must be going. He said okay and rose to his feet. I handed him back his bank bag containing his wallet in case there might be a bill that needed taken care of, but apparently there wasn't because Russo just tucked it away quickly. He told Cherokee and Unk to wait there and he would be right back with the van. Russo had been drinking during the dinner, so he hadn't done any sobering up. We went out and got into my car. A guy opened the gate for us and we drove back towards the 930 Club. When we came to a stop sign, we could see up ahead a police officer who was standing beside of a flare. The flare was indicating a sinkhole in the pavement. Russo said for me to pull up to the officer. He needed to ask him a question. I said, "What do you need to ask him?" "Just please, just do," Russo insisted, seeming frustrated by my lack of trust. So I pulled up to the cop who was on the driver's side of my car and rolled down the window. As I turned to Russo, I saw his frustrated look was gone, and an ornery smile was spreading across his face. I knew I'd made a mistake, and Russo had tricked me. I wanted to just pull away at that point, but it was too late. That would look suspicious. He has a question for you," I said to the cop. Making a quick estimation of this cop, I would guess he was a decent guy. He didn't seem bothered that I'd stopped to ask him a question. He bent down to the window and looked across to Russo. Russo said, "Hello, officer. How are you doing tonight?" Slurring every word. The cop said, "Okay, but not as good as you, it appears," smiling and making light of the fact that Russo was obviously intoxicated. There was a pause, an uncomfortable moment of silence which I held my breath, before the officer said, "Was that your question?" "Oh, ho, 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 ho." Russo laughed to flatter the officer for his sense of humor. "No, we need to know how to get to New York. We need to get to New York fast." "Oh, okay," the officer said. He looked at me and began giving me directions to I-95. Russo's whole little joke was to make me be stopped in the middle of the road talking to a cop for no reason. So while the officer was giving directions and I was trying to look like I was mentally making notes of every word, I could sense Russo in the passenger seat chuckling to himself over his little prank. As the officer concluded with his directions, I said, "Okay, thank you, sir." "No problem, don't mention it," the policeman said, and began to rise back up from the window. But he was called back down by Russo, saying, "Sir, officer, sir." As the cop was bending back down to the window, I was thinking, oh God, what now? Russo extended his hand across the car towards the cop. The officer reached his hand in to shake his hand with Russo. To the officer's surprise, Russo began to pull his hand in towards his lips to kiss the back of it. I learned from a documentary about Ethiopia that hand kissing is an act of common courtesy there, but as the police officer quickly retracted his hand, I think he may have just been reacting on reflex to the fact that his arm was being pulled farther into the car. Russo became very offended and snarled, "Well, fuck you then, you fucking monkey." "Go, Bobby, go," he said. I pulled away from the cop and watched him in the side mirror standing there looking bitter as we drove away. Russo began cracking up and laughed all the way to his van parked near the 930 Club. I wanted to just get my stuff out of his van there, but he insisted that we drive back over to the restaurant. So we drove it back there instead, where I was assisted by restaurant staff as we transferred the stuff from Russo's van into my little hatchback. This was all done quickly as the gate of the restaurant staff parking lot remained open. I got in my packed car and said a friendly goodbye and sincere thanks to everyone, and then headed away from the restaurant. I hadn't gone more than a block or so before I realized that I was being followed by a police car. I made real sure to drive in a straight line. But a block or two later, the lights came on. I pulled over to the side of the road. I began getting my license and registration from the glove box prepared as I waited for the cop to come to the window. But when I looked back, I saw that the two police officers were in the car that pulled me over had went behind the police cruiser to a big SUV. A lady dressed in business clothes. A dress skirt and high heels stepped out of the SUV. I watched as she conversed with the police officers before they turned and walked back towards my car. As one of them reached the car, I extended the license and registration towards him. He received it from me, but to my surprise said, "Sir, please step out of the vehicle." "I don't even know why you pulled me over," I replied. By this point, the second officer had arrived, and they seemed intense about this traffic stop, so I didn't want to get them more angry. I opened the door and got out as the first officer said, "We are not required, nor are we advised to discuss the purpose of this stop." They began opening the doors of the car and looking through it. "I don't know what you're looking for in there, but I promise you're not even going to find a roach." The officer who was closest to me stopped and turned to me and said, "Sir, if we were to find drugs in this search, we wouldn't legally even be able to arrest you for it because that's not what this is about." As I looked back towards the woman who was waiting outside the SUV, I realized that this was part of a Homeland Security operation. The Homeland Security, which I'd heard so much about. Then one of the officers said, "Sir, what did you load into your car from that restaurant back there?" "Food vending supplies," I answered. Then I began explaining to them how I was there as a guest of an Ethiopian food vending friend of mine. I explained that we were just transferring some of my equipment from his van. My story was substantiated by the fact that my car was full of food vending supplies. The two officers went back to the SUV and spoke with the woman briefly before returning and saying I was free to go. Frankly, I can understand how the sight of us transferring things from vehicles in the back of that restaurant looked suspicious, especially to people who had orders to be on the lookout for suspicious activity. As I drove home towards the house, I hoped X would enjoy some humor in this otherwise failed night of food vending, thanks to my dinner with Russo.